Hi, and thanks for joining us today for this Data Connectors session, learning from Fortune 100 leaders and how they protect remote data. My name's Rick Wilson, so pleased to be with you today at the Philadelphia event. I'm coming to you from the western side of the state over in the Pittsburgh area today, but I'm happy to be here no matter where you're logging in from today to watch the session. I've been with Sherpa Software for a little over 12 years. Currently, I'm Vice President of Strategy and Solutions. Before we get into the content for today, just maybe a couple of housekeeping notes for you. We are an exhibitor today, so if you have time or you have perhaps questions after the event, please stop into our virtual booth and talk to my colleague Greg, who's from our client success team. Greg can help you get answers to any questions you might have. And I certainly would welcome any feedback you might have on the presentation or perhaps the content that is being included. And then the second thing was I typically give these kinds of talks to a live audience. And because of that, I might be moving around a little bit, or you might see my hands. I tend to talk with my hands. So I just ask your indulgence if that's a little distracting on the camera. So let's get started with content. I'd like to begin these kinds of sessions by asking, why does it even matter? Why is it important for us to be worried about information that's being stored, especially in remote locations today? And I'm kicking that off with a trivia question here. Approximately how many consumer records were breached in the year 2018? And I'll give you a second or two to mull that over as we wait for the slide to reveal the answer to us here. That's right. Option C, 2.8 billion with a B, a very large statistic by any measure. And if you take a look at how that breaks down, we've sourced a Ponemon study from 2019 that sort of gives a breakdown of the various data breaches by size. Even if you look at the far left hand of the spectrum, what we would consider perhaps a small breach, 10,000 records, you're looking at $2.2 million in remediation costs for that small breach subset. That's a big number to deal with by any standards. And that doesn't even consider some of the things like loss in reputation or damage to your employees and so forth. This is just remuneration costs associated with fines and paybacks, extended credit monitoring, that sort of thing. Now, I know what you might be thinking, some of you. Hey, Rick, this is interesting, but we're not in a consumer-facing organization. So that really doesn't apply to us, right? We're a B2B type provider. Even if you are, you need to be concerned about information that's being stored out there in the wild. What about client confidentiality? What about intellectual property? We're going to talk a little bit more about those types of incidents as we roll along here. So let's consider for a moment what we like to call data insecurity, the fact that you may not be confident that all of your information is being locked down properly or in fact being handled properly by your employees. And on the right-hand side of the slide here, I've listed a number of reasons why you might have cause for some data insecurity. The top couple of bullets really are employees who just are not following the rules or perhaps not aware of the rules, so they're mishandling your information. In the middle of the slide, kind of those middle bullets, we start to talk about things that are a little bit more nefarious. Employees who may be perhaps trying to obtain information for a competitor. Maybe they're trying to obtain information from themselves in hopes of going to work for a competitor. But in any event, they're maliciously damaging the organization by mishandling your data. And then we, of course, have the category of just pure out and out accidents. Hey, I meant to send this email to party X and I sent it to party Y. Outlook in particular is really hazardous for this because if you start to type a portion of an address, it pulls it up from your buffer and you're maybe not paying complete attention. You could easily send it to the wrong party because you clicked send before you took time to thoroughly read who the recipient of that message was. So areas that maybe you need to be paying attention to from a process and control point of view. Let's wrap some economics around that data insecurity. This slide talks about information from a Verizon study. This one's actually pretty fresh, 2019, and it was a data breach analysis that Verizon conducted. And you'll see on the right-hand side, of course, we have the same categories of data insecurity that might have occurred on the previous slide. But now we've got some kind of metric for managing or determining how much of that was responsible by employees inside your organization. And this Verizon study, in fact, determined that 34% of those types of breaches were being caused by people either improperly or maliciously or accidentally mistreating information. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing in my job is talking to prospective customers, CISOs, CIOs, IT directors, folks like yourselves, about what their concerns are with regards to information that might be out and not properly secured in their environment. And based on those conversations and things that we've learned from customers that we've dealt with in the past, we've prepared a little threat matrix to outline those various categories. And the idea here is to perhaps just get you thinking about different areas in your organization that may or may not have adequate protection. So the major category that I hear most often, that's why I placed this one first, was concerns over sensitive data. The interesting thing to me is sensitive data is so widely varying from organization to organization. So I have customers that I support directly who are everywhere from professional sports organizations to manufacturers, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and all of those organizations are concerned or trying to manage sensitive information. However, that sensitive information is different almost across the board from place to place. So part of the challenge here is identifying what's sensitive in your organization so that you can come up with some kind of a plan to control and monitor that information. Second category we hear often is employee flight risk. So this takes actually two forms: people that you might be concerned about leaving the organization. Maybe you got wind that they're unhappy and you're worried about them sequestering data before they leave that they might want to offer to a competitor. The other form that we see is people who have left the organization and now you want to make sure whatever content they left behind is locked down so they can't get back to it. So I wanted to share a little story with you around this category in particular, especially that bottom goal of eliminating loss of intellectual property. About probably 2 months ago now, before the pandemic hit, I was giving a similar presentation to a president of a major bank, or a CISO actually of a major bank here in the Pittsburgh market. And she was politely listening to our outline of insider threats and potential risks and so forth. But when we started to talk about intellectual property, she sat up in her seat, she leaned forward, and she got very active in the presentation. And she later told us that what really piqued her interest there was the fact that her employees really didn't have any controls over intellectual property, and she was very concerned about that. She said, now, don't get me wrong, Social Security numbers, of course, we have to monitor, but there's thousands of those already on the dark web. I'm a little less concerned about those leaking out of the organization than I am with intellectual property. Think things like whatever their merger and acquisition plans are for the upcoming year, or maybe whatever they're going to do with branch consolidation moving forward. Definitely information that you wouldn't want a competitor to be able to obtain. Third category here is preemptive, can't get that word out, preemptive incident response. So we see this a lot as an exercise in classification, being able to look at your content ahead of time and put some parameters around that. Hey, this is sensitive, this is business critical, this contains PII. What that does then is it really shortens the response time on the back end when something does occur, or if it does occur. For example, somebody loses their laptop, they live at a TSA counter, it gets stolen, left in a taxi cab, whatever. If your information that's on that machine has been classified, you can pretty quickly answer the question, how much sensitive data, PII, business critical information, whatever the category is, was contained on that device. But you can't do that if you haven't examined the content and applied some classification to it. Next, search and destroy. We all kind of deal with this on an ongoing basis. We see it mostly in the email world. Although it's gotten a lot better with advanced spam filtering and threat protection, there still are phishing messages that get out in the environment, or maybe loose attachments that have viruses or whatever. And the ability to have a tool already deployed in place that you can use to go out and find that content in the mailbox or wherever it might be and eliminate it is really very valuable, and it shortens that amount of time it takes to deal with the threat. So doing a data risk assessment mapping is a step that people often overlook. So this is the idea of identifying where content is, creating that data map so that you know who has it, where it's at, what business process it is attached to, and being able to identify that ahead of time makes you much more readily able to address it in the event of a breach and kind of exercise the scope of that breach, or determine how extensive, I should say, the scope of that breach is. And then finally, being able to prepare in advance for an e-discovery situation, or maybe more importantly these days, these privacy mandates that are coming down in a legislative format. So we're hearing tons about, of course, California consumer protection. GDPR has been out now for a couple of years. It's pretty well established. But if you don't have tools to be able to identify this information when a consumer request comes in, once you've got a data subject access request, for example, the ability to respond to that quickly, find that information, and then determine what your remediation plan is for the person that placed that DSAR request. All of these are areas where your data at rest can potentially be a threat, and you need to be able to put some controls around it, or you should at least be thinking about placing some controls around it. So that leads me up to my second trivia question today. Approximately how much of your organization's data is readily available and important to your business? This one usually surprises people, so I'll give you a second to think about that answer as the falses disappear and the true answer of 16% is revealed. I like to call that 16% the data Berg. I love this slide. So in all fairness, I borrowed this. I guess you can't say I stole it if I give credit, right? So I borrowed this slide from a friend of mine, Jeffrey Scherer, who is the Chief Innovation Counsel at Actuate Law Firm in Chicago. And a couple of weeks ago, Jeffrey and I did a webinar and he used this slide, and I just love the depiction that it gives for your data. So Jeff, thanks for showing me this slide, introducing it to me, and letting me borrow it for this presentation. Now this data is a little bit old, it's from 2016, but the important thing is it's still applicable today, right? So if you look at the data Berg, our iceberg graphic on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see that over half of that is what we're typically considering dark data, information that's out in the enterprise that you really have no idea about. And we all deal with this, right? On that network file share that's got 3 terabytes of storage, I'll bet you there's information that was created by an employee who hasn't worked for the company for years. And that content might be 3, 5, 7, 10 years old that's still sitting on that network file share. Even if you move up to the top of the slide into the 46%, you can see that a big chunk of the 46%, this is the stuff that we know about now, the information that we're aware of. Maybe it's been tagged with an identifier, maybe it's been classified, but a big chunk of it is still not information that we need to keep. It's in that rot category that we talk about. It's either redundant, it's outdated, it's trivial. Bottom line is, it's information we don't need, we shouldn't be keeping anymore because it proposes undue risk and introduces that to the organization. And then finally, up at the top, we get that 16% of business critical data that you really want to be concerned about and monitor. But if you can find a way to minimize or eliminate some of that below the water level information, you're definitely on the right track. And that kind of leads me in then to the case studies that we're going to talk about today. So I've selected 2 organizations that we're going to kind of walk through. And in both situations here, probably it's fair to say that this first one is kind of addressing that data Berg situation, while the second one is a little bit more process oriented. But let's think about these, and I'll kind of walk you through them. So this customer is managing a lot of content, and as I said, they really fit that data Berg model very nicely. So let's look at the first use case I have for this customer. The project started out with a fairly simple goal. We want to be able to identify specific types of content in two areas, either contained in PST files on our employee devices or that are on the hard drives of those devices. And there were identifying characteristics for that content that they wanted to check on, and then they wanted to purge it in accordance with their document retention goals. So fairly simple business use case. What complicated it was the fact that there were over 112,000 workstations that they wanted to apply this to. And when we did the checking on those 112,000 workstations, we determined that there were over 700,000 PST files where this information might be residing. So scale made this one particularly challenging. As you can well imagine, it takes some amount of time to roll any enforcement program out generally, but when you're talking about rolling it out to 112,000 workstations and that number of content repositories, it takes an extended amount of time, over a year in fact, to be able to do that. But the ultimate goal was now they've got control over that information, and they're found a way to enforce that document management policy and adhere to it a little bit more closely, and they didn't have any way to do that prior to implementing the solution. What was interesting to me then was that it sort of led into the second use case for the same organization, different departments. And now we were in the Office of General Counsel. Use case one started out with their messaging team. So OGC went out and said, hey, we're concerned about the amount of old content that's being kept in those 700,000 PST files. Some of the obvious use cases, right? So we're backing that information up. It's causing a lot of extra storage for backups, but even more important than that, there's some specific risk litigation issues that we really don't want that kind of information to be maintained. And we believe that if employees were aware that it was out there, they would give us permission to be able to go out and remove it. So that's what this project was really all about. The project was about being able to go out and assess content in PST files for specific employees and present them with some statistics about how much of that information exceeded certain age thresholds. And you can see there 3 to 7 and over 7 were the two categories. They did this first with a pilot group of about 20 individuals, then they scaled it up to a couple of hundred, and then we finally went to almost 1,000. And as part of that POC study, that they found out was once they presented that information to the people who had it resident on their machines and asked them to review it, over half of that information they got permission to delete directly from the employee. That's usually one of the big roadblocks with these kinds of projects, right? My employees are going to scream bloody murder if I start deleting information. No way I can get away with that. Well, maybe there is. If you help them understand how old, redundant, outdated, however you want to characterize it, that information is, they just might give you permission to delete a chunk of it. So maybe another approach to consider. And then finally, use case 3. Again, different department. This time we're working with the security team. So it was the messaging team, Office of General Counsel. Now we're working with the security team. And in their role, security guys are concerned with making sure that there's not client information being kept unduly on machines that are out there in the environment. So the way this project typically works is the engagement managers come to the security team once an engagement's complete and say, I want you to scan Joe's machine, and I want you to look for any files that might have these keywords, these phrases, these patterns, whatever they are. Pretty much a sensitive data discovery process, except the sensitive data criteria, as I mentioned earlier, varies in this case from engagement to engagement. So it's different for this client than it is for that next client. And then the security team uses software to be able to go out, build that search, provide back to the engagement manager a list of the content, and then the engagement manager can work directly with the consultant to say, how do we mitigate this? Do we need to keep it? Is it outside the guidelines that we have for client information for this particular project and deal with it. So that's case study one, or customer number one, I should say. Let's roll on and take a look then at customer number two. Totally different approach here. Same end goal, being able to manage information that employees are keeping on devices. In this case, it's a little bit more encompassing. So this was automating a pre-existing business process to be able to accomplish a similar kind of goal to what we talked about on the last slide. So this one began with what the clients call onboarding. And the way that works is company sells a new project, the Burgermeister project, and the Burgermeister project is going to have Mary and Jeanette and Grant work on it. Hey, great. So what happens automatically then, once that project is created in the project management application, it triggers a set of processes inside their content management area here. And what happens is, for each one of those employees, for Marion and Grant and Jeanette, we create folders on their local hard drive that are specific to client communications for that project. We create email folders where they can store client communication for that project. And we create a SharePoint site where they can collaborate and share information with the client during the course of the project. Once all that's done, those three areas are created and kind of predefined for them. Then we notify them via email that, hey, congratulations, Grant, you're now on this project. You've got exactly the right set of skills and experience that we need. And we've created these repositories for you to use as you work on the engagement. So just kind of a way to make sure that all of that information is structured in a place where the retention team, document management team, can make sure that they are able to reach it or understand where it should be. So that would be the onboarding process. And then of course there's a parallel to that takes place when that project ends and those consultants offboard. So they've now completed the project. They've done their client wrap up on the Burgermeister project. They presented their report. They've got the client sign off. We're done. We check out. So the engagement manager can now take that information and say, okay, this project is complete, and generate a report that goes out and examines those three machines, Marion's and Grant's and Marion and Grant and Jeanette's hard drives on their devices, make sure that the files that were created during that engagement have properly been archived and no longer exist on those machines. They can make sure that the email folders have been purged correctly, and they can address anything that's left over in the SharePoint repository. Because all that is standardized, the global records management team now knows where to go and check for it. So that would be part of that offboarding process. Now we're just kicking off the third phase of this, which is something that'll sound familiar based on the client one discussion, and that would be allowing employees then to monitor the information that was left on their devices. So here's the way that works, right? As part of that offboarding, we run the report and we say, Grant had this many emails, Grant had this many files, and he owned these items in SharePoint. Grant now gets an email notification that says, these items from Project Burgermeister are still on your machine or in your email or on your SharePoint area. Can we remove them? And there's a portal that Grant can log into and indicate disposition on each one of those items. Delete, 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 retain, archive, whatever that case may be. They can define the tags that allow them to do that. That process then feeds back into global records management. They can approve it. The consultant submits those final changes. Global Records approves it, and those dispositions can be carried out, in some cases in an automatic fashion. Not always, but they're working towards that as a more uniform part of the business process. So maybe just food for thought as you're starting to put together your goals for information governance. Here's how some other clients are doing it. By the way, this customer is a little smaller than the last one. I mentioned customer one, we had 112,000 workstations, employees that we were managing. This one's probably a little bit more like 12 or 13,000. So a little bit more modest in scope, certainly, than the first one. But you know what? These principles can apply to any size organization. So it really doesn't matter whether you're hundreds of thousands or 50. You can still start to identify, secure, and lock down that information. So finally, just to wrap up today for the presentation, maybe a little bit of information about us. We are Sherpa Software, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation. We're based in Pittsburgh. We've been doing this for a long time, almost 20 years. We'll have our 20-year anniversary in September, which is a real milestone in the software business. For 20 years, people have been relying on our software to help them manage information. So please stop by the virtual booth if you'd like a little bit more information. Greg or I would be happy to talk to you. And thanks again for attending the presentation today. I hope it was useful. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Bye.